When the prophet couldn't find a solution that would satisfy her, she said, "I won't leave until this issue is resolved." They argue, the prophet, and then Masua Halmujadila is revealed. The women of that time were aware that they were subjects in their own right. Now, trying to maintain traditional codes in an environment where these relationships have changed. Now, it becomes oppression against women in the 20th and 21st centuries in modern Islam. During a time when modernity is trying to pull women out of their homes and excessive resistance develops, insisting that women should stay at home. We are being led to believe as if this is the only form of religion. There are series and discussions about justice. But when it comes to justice between men and women, the approach is usually like this. So justice is putting something in its proper place. That is, neither putting it lower nor giving it more than it deserves. That's how they've conceptualized it. And from this point, especially when making interpretations about justice in male-female relationships, they say that God created men superior to women and placed men in a higher hierarchical position than women. And since they believe that women were created with a nature that is weaker than men, more in need of protection, a bit smarter than a child, but still childlike. In other words, because they think women are, hierarchically, in a lower category than men. Defining women this way fits very well with the concept of justice held by our Islamic scholars. So, for them, since Allah created things this way, we should accept it as such, and when making judgments or interpretations, we should base them on this understanding. They thought that interpreting things this way would be more just, because the idea of equality at the time when these topics were being discussed, there was no debate about equality. There was no concept of equality. And this wasn't just between men and women. There wasn't even an idea of equality among men themselves. Because society was stratified, there were hierarchies, and these hierarchies were established according to the conditions of that time. These hierarchies were also legitimized in some way by religion, and they were accepted. Therefore, woman, as someone governed by a man, to consider her weaker than a man, to imagine her this way and to place her in a status below men was, for our Islamic scholars, seen as a practice and an understanding in which justice was realized.
We're talking about something that happened in the past. There's a period-specific perspective here. When we move beyond traditional roles and look at the modern era, how can we transform this into a different form? Or how does religion view this?
Well, actually, religion doesn't look at it. It's us who do. So it's important to make this distinction. Even today, there are still people who think more traditionally. People who talk about and interpret religion based on this understanding of justice use it to oppose the idea of equality, for example. I mean, in the modern world, the idea of gender equality or that people are born with equal rights is a dominant concept. I mean, everything, all legal regulations, ideals, the goals that are set, all of them are based on this understanding of equality. Muslims in general object to this from the following point. They say, no, God did not create men and women equal. He created them differently. So for us, equality, that would be oppressing both genders. It would be a violation of justice. We ensure justice by putting men where they belong and women where they belong. That way, we don't oppress either gender. This is where they stop. So what happens when they stop here? Whatever is in the fiqh becomes the Islam that is practiced. For them, that's what should be lived. So what does that mean? For example, in marriage, the man is the active party. It's the man who proposes. It's the man who divorces. The right to divorce belongs to the man. The man who is the khawam is the one who is supposed to protect and look after the woman. So the woman is always in that traditional, maybe what you recall it. 7. It is perceived as if we were moving in the conditions of the 21st century, and there is no need to make an update here. But updates are becoming inevitable. Why is that? Because some of these communities that think this way, for example, still try to keep women in those same conditions. They don't send them to school. For women, motherhood, a life inside the home. A limited education in their own religious schools, that's their vision. For these groups, women were already, under the conditions of that day, 7. Because it was kept in century conditions. It doesn't even challenge their sense of justice. But there are actually many different forms of being Muslim outside of this. Yeah, let's look at our country. In our country, the government, our administrative system, is already a secular, laicist system, and as Muslims, we've actually gotten used to secularism. And among religious communities, people are sending their daughters to school. Right now, girls who are studying are getting professions. When they have a profession in terms of status and local prestige, they move to a higher position than their old or traditional role as women, and relationships change. Now, in an environment where these relationships are changing, trying to maintain traditional codes, this time women are being oppressed. How much happiness this brings to men is also debatable. Therefore, we are having discussions about it being updated again already. We're writing books. And since it's mostly women who suffer from this, there's an effort to update things, mainly driven by women. That's how I'd put it. So right now, the idea of equality. Of course, no one is talking about biological equality here. You know, sometimes some of our politicians say, can men and women really be equal? Yes, in that sense, men aren't even equal among themselves. Women aren't equal among themselves either. Everyone is unique. Everyone is one of a kind. But, and no matter what our gender, ethnic background, religious belief, or philosophical view is, the philosophy of taking part in public life as citizens with equal rights is a philosophy that, since the Enlightenment, women have also embraced and fought for in the struggle for women's rights. This struggle has also taken place in Turkey. In fact, it goes back to the Ottoman era. So, in the end, we adopted the idea of equality. Therefore, when it comes to putting things where they truly belong, we see a different idea of where women should be. In other words, whatever women deserve. Their abilities, the education they've received, their talents, their goals. In line with all of this, We believe that being wherever they deserve to be is more in line with the concepts of justice and equality.
In fact, the woman herself determines her own place, her place in society, and her place in the family. In this way, because in the earliest Islamic texts or in the early understanding of Islam, there was a perspective influenced by society where men's views always defined and determined the role of women. And this included things like the right to education, which actually required women to stay away from social life. These were the things that caused women to be deprived of their rights in society. Here, we're talking about an update, a change that came with the modern era. This situation.
Yes, actually, if you look at it, you need to separate the time of the Prophet Muhammad from the periods that came after. In other words, during the time when the revelation was coming down, women were recognized as addressees. The Prophet Muhammad addressed women directly, and women accepted this engagement. They migrated, participated in battles, pledged allegiance. That is, they expressed their political will. In other words, he could not take allegiance from women. The Prophet Muhammad, why did he do it? I mean, why did he feel the need to take a pledge of allegiance from women? And when he took the pledge from women, the listed conditions were, for example, to obey the Prophet in what is right and good. A traitor, a traitor, a traitor. For example, we often define being a good Muslim as unquestioning, without asking questions, as simply obeying. However, in the Quran, even obedience to the Prophet Muhammad has its boundaries, and this boundary is to obey him only in what is right and good. Obey. So, the fact that these women's pledge of allegiance was adopted as a principle from the very early days of Islam and continued afterward. For example, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, when Abu Bakr was chosen as the caliph. For instance, Fatima objected and did not pledge allegiance to Abu Bakr until she passed away. In other words, she exercised her right to make a political choice. We also know, for example, the story of Kalwa. She complained about her husband's behavior toward her. She asks the Prophet to find a solution. When the Prophet can't find a solution that satisfies her, she says, "I'm not leaving here until this issue is resolved." She argues, and the Prophet, and then the Surah Al-Mujadila is revealed. So, the women of that time were aware that they were subjects in their own right. Everyone is aware of this and acts as a subject, not like an object. They strive to solve their problems. They involve the Prophet in the process, where they struggle with others. Now, this is a very unique with historical experience. But this doesn't get repeated. The period we call the era of turmoil actually becomes a time when everyone is a bit more withdrawn, especially women. But, for example, they can't prevent this. For instance, take the Hajj pilgrimage today. Muslims who go on Hajj or Umrah see this. I mean, the whole idea of privacy, that men and women can't be together, that they have to sit separately, the story of the curtain, the harem and Salamlik separation. None of these exist in the environment of Umrah. In other words, at the Kaaba, in Mecca, they're not there. So what does this show us? That men and women constantly socializing separately from each other. If this is a fundamental principle of Islam, then why isn't there such a practice at the Kaaba? The fact that it doesn't exist here shows us that this isn't actually a fundamental rule. In fact, this was something specifically directed at the wives of the Prophet. So, it's clear who that's about. After a certain period, it was said that if someone wanted something from you, they should ask from behind a curtain. That's the issue. There was a practice specific to them, to their hierarchical status. But look at our situation, what was commanded to them. People started thinking, if it's for them, it must apply to all other believing women too. This is the first period that exemplifies male-female socialization. That example was abolished, and they paved the way for men and women to socialize separately. During the time of the Prophet, men and women were together in the mosque and in every setting. In other words, there is a complete socialization of men and women living together. We see that example. This is a very interesting thing, but for some reason, this has always been distorted when it was passed down to us. I mean, it's always like the curtain verse, the verse about the jilbab. Based on these verses, a whole system of segregation laws was created. A segregation system was established. This is also how beneficial this has actually been. But here's how it has harmed women. For example, when it comes to education, it became an area mostly dominated by men. Only girls from scholarly families were able to benefit from that education. For example, during the Mamluk period, we see many women involved in Hadith studies. Some famous Hadith scholars had female teachers from whom they learned Hadith and received Hadith education. So despite all of this, women still managed to make their presence felt. But this 20th century and 21st century Islam, I mean, in the modern era where women are, in a period when modernity is trying to pull women out of their homes, there is an extreme resistance being developed. And we are being led to believe that women staying at home is the only true form of religion. But actually, when we look at the past, this is not the only form.
It turns into a situation seen as the only form and the foundation of religion, as if there is no other choice, as if the only thing that will protect and uphold religion is women staying at home. It looks like women are being erased from social life. Here, professor in social life. The changing role of women is actually most often linked to concerns about the breakdown of the family structure. In general, when it comes to women, being active in social life, participating in education, and entering the workforce, there's a concern that this will somehow disrupt the family structure. Usually, this is the kind of criticism or commentary made about the situation. In your opinion, does the profile of a working mother affect the family structure? For example, the most feared scenario is that this will disrupt all the balances and even bring a negative perspective towards religion. How do you think this change in roles affects the family? What are your thoughts?
Now, first of all, we need to look at this. I mean, in rural agricultural societies, women have always worked. In fact, they worked so much that sometimes they couldn't even take care of their children. Children were either taken to the fields or left at home in the care of an older child or an elderly person. But for example, in these traditional agricultural societies, women participating in agriculture as unpaid labor. It's become so normalized that no one ever discusses it from a religious perspective. Like, why are you taking these women to the fields? Isn't it a sin? Their bodies are weaker. They struggle a lot. They can't take care of their children. At home, kids fall into the fire. All sorts of things happen. There are so many stories like this in villages, but no one ever talks about how women working as agricultural laborers shouldn't work and should stay home to look after their kids. What are we talking about? We're talking about women working in positions where their status rises and they become equal to men. Why are we talking about this? First, women are really showing great success in certain fields. I mean, some professions are becoming more female-dominated. For example, one of them is theology. When I was studying theology, us girls made up about 10%. Now, male students make up about 10%. So, religious studies are falling into the hands of women. I don't know how uneasy they are about this, but personally, I quite like it. Besides that, there are professions like teaching, professions like medicine, and many others, even law right now. There are a lot of female students in law. Now, yes, both in these kinds of professions, the clustering of women in these professions, in terms of male unemployment and male prestige, is seen as a problem in some communities or in some people's minds. And also women, in this way, their status rises. That is, at home, they become equal to their husbands. They gain a say, they gain respect. This is what really bothers them. In other words, what they think will disrupt the family is the woman becoming equal there, participating in decision-making processes, having an identity outside, having a career, and the self-confidence that comes with it reflecting on relationships at home. This is something they still can't handle.
And when the time comes, she actually has the power to break up that family too. I mean, if necessary.
Yes, unlike women in the past, young women today don't say, I suffered in silence but pretended everything was fine. What do? If there is violence at home, if there is incompatibility, they don't see any point in continuing such a marriage. When they see that it's harming their own psychological health, when they see that it is causing harm, they call it a giant fish. And this makes men uneasy. So, women standing up for their own fate, having their own money, having their own cars, having a say in things, these are not things that are easily accepted yet in our Islam. This is not something that is accepted with such ease in the community. They always want men to have a bit more of an advantage. Let's give men a little more favoritism. Let them be the ones in charge, basically, so they can feel good about themselves. That's their mindset.
So their egos are satisfied, teacher.
Well, no, I mean, they actually see this as part of men's nature. They think men are just naturally like this. Let's keep him in a position that fits his nature so that he feels good about himself, so he doesn't go through a masculinity crisis. These are the kinds of ideas out there. In fact, when I look at the new personal development trends, for example, these are also the things that our religious circles have adopted. It's a bit about this, men acting like men, women acting like women, you know. A woman shouldn't become masculine. She shouldn't cross her boundaries. In other words, she shouldn't take on too much responsibility. These are always recommended. So a woman should keep her distinctiveness, protect her boundaries, and not interfere in men's affairs. Maybe there's some truth to the idea that men should do certain things. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, but the idea of women gaining status does cause concern. We can sum it up like that.
Great interpretation. Thank you very much. We've covered all aspects, including this topic. I hope this sparks further discussion for our viewers as well in the context of gender justice. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Dear viewers, we talked about Islam and gender justice, the roles of men and women. Today, see you in the next episode. Tipon.